contains an excessive number of charts and graphs. Viewer discretion is advised.
Hey everyone, how are you doing today? No, really, I want to know, how are you, your community, and your country doing? Are things getting better for you, or do they feel like they're getting worse? Are you worried about the future? Do you look back to the past and think it was a better, simpler time? Today, we dive into a significant issue, the disparity on how we feel and what the data shows about our world, particularly the United States economy. Why do so many Americans feel like things are getting worse when the numbers actually tell a different story? Stick around and we'll explore why this happens and what we can do to overcome our biases. Now, I'm going to apply an American bias today, so apologies to my international viewers. If you're like many Americans, you're probably worried about the state of our country. Concerns about the economy, productivity, job market, and inflation are at the forefront of our minds. However, there's an underlying issue I want to discuss with you, the significant disparity on how we feel and how things are actually going according to the data. If it's your first time here, I'm Jared, a huge nerd who loves investigating the deeper why behind data and behaviors. Recently, in my daily email from Morning Brew, I saw a Harris Guardian poll about how Americans feel about the economy. This sent me down a rabbit hole of economics reports and psychology papers to figure out what was going on and, more importantly, how to create my next YouTube rant with suggestions on what to do about it. Before diving in, I'm working on some related longer form content, but today I wanted to share this video to start the conversation and ensure my deeper research reflects things that you value. So as I share this discussion, I'd love to hear your thoughts, particularly what you agree with and what questions remain. Let's have a quick conversation about the role facts play in fostering sentiment. The truth is, perhaps not as much as we'd like to think. And to help illustrate this point, let's bring in an old friend, Stephen Colbert. Thanks for joining me, pre-recorded out of context Stephen from 20 years ago. To get started, what do you feel is the key aspect dividing Americans?
We are divided between those who think with their head and those who know with their heart.
But Stephen, I'm a firm believer in gaining experience through reading. Isn't that a core principle on how we can grow our knowledge?
I don't trust books. They're all fact, no heart.
That doesn't make sense. I'm a scientist. Data is data. The economics data in the US points to things going quite well at the moment.
Well, mister, that's because you looked it up in a book. Next time, try looking it up in your gut.
Colbert coined the phrase truthiness to represent this idea. Facts are less meaningful than what we feel. I firmly believe this concept has only grown in prevalence over the past 20 years, and nowhere is this more apparent than in today's economic data and the associated sentiment of Americans. Bloomberg ran a poll in October 2023 asking if people felt the economy was headed in the right direction. They found that 51% of individuals believe things were going well for their city or town, but 74% believe things were going in the wrong direction nationally. This implies about half of Americans who are happy with their local trajectory think that things are doing the opposite for the country as a whole. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Another poll from Harris showed 55% of Americans believe the economy is shrinking, 56% believe we're in a recession right now, 49% think the stock market is down for 2024, and 49% feel employment is at a 50-year high. Most critically, 72% believe inflation continues to increase. But what are the facts? Let's break it down. I promise to try to make it as painless as possible, and there's some less mathy psychology stuff coming up. First, let's talk about GDP growth. According to the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the U.S. gross domestic product grew by 1.6% in Q1 2024. This was down a little from 3.4% in Q4 of 23, but it's still growing. So despite what your economic gut may be telling you, the economy is not shrinking. Now let's look at the stock market. As of the recording of this video, each of the major stock market indices hit an all-time high in the past week. For the year, they're each up over 10% following significant increases in 2023 as well. This isn't what you'd expect if the overall economy was tanking. Unemployment is another critical metric. The unemployment rate remains at a half-century low, below 4% in the most recent jobs report. This is a strong indicator of a healthy job market, especially for college-educated workers. Finally, let's discuss inflation. The Federal Reserve continues to keep interest rates high to try to cool inflation. While it remains above the Fed's target of 2%, it has dropped significantly from the recent peak of over 9% in June of 2022. The trend is moving in the right direction, even if we're not quite there yet. So what does all this data mean? Essentially, it means the US economy is growing, the job market remains tight with low unemployment, and while inflation is still higher than the Fed's arbitrary target, it's down significantly from the post-pandemic spike observed worldwide. Yet, Despite these positive indicators, many people still feel pessimistic about the economy. For additional context for how sentiment compares to the actual economic data, the Brookings Institute did some analysis on data that's tracked by the San Francisco Federal Reserve. This data compares the sentiment of Americans compared to the expected value based on where the economy is at. From this chart, we can see sentiment is at an all-time low, where Americans are more negative currently about the economy relative to the actual data compared to any time in the past 40 years. So why is there such a significant gap between public sentiment and the actual data? To understand this, we must look at psychological biases and broader perspectives. First, let's have a pop quiz. In the last 20 years, the percentage of people in the world living in extreme poverty has A, more than doubled, B, stayed about the same, or C, almost halved. This is a question from Hans Rosling's work in Factfulness. I love this book, and I'm developing other videos that dive into his work more deeply. In this book, Rosling presents data that counter common misconceptions about global progress. Back to our quiz question, the answer is C. In the last 20 years, the percentage of people living in extreme poverty has almost halved. Despite this significant progress, many people, particularly those in high-income nations, have a more pessimistic worldview. Even among the most informed individuals like those of the United Nations, surveys consistently show a more pessimistic view than the actual data supports. The question is why, and how does this relate to Americans' inaccurate perception of the US economy? Rosling highlights several potential sources for this, including the bias of our personal experiences, the limitation of being taught from outdated information, and the impact of sensationalistic media, which combine to make our perception of the world worse than reality. So what do we do about this? I want to examine what's happening in our minds and discuss techniques for managing it. So to start, let's examine the role of the media. Media often highlights negative news because it attracts more attention and engagement. This is known as negativity bias, where negative events and information grab our attention more than the positive ones. Media outlets capitalize on this by focusing on stories that are likely to evoke strong emotional responses such as fear, anger, and sadness. For example, during the pandemic, I pretty much decided that I needed to give up social media, particularly Facebook and Twitter. Doom scrolling consumed me, and I sought out opportunities to fact check and provide data I thought would help people since I genuinely had expertise in relevant technical areas. Ultimately, I learned that Twitter and fact-checking sensationalist, negativity-biased posts was worse for my health than nearly anything else, and amplified my anxiety and stress. While it's important to stay informed, this constant exposure to negative news can distort our perception of reality, making us believe things are worse than they actually are, and this will impact some of our biases further down the list. However, while sensationalism plays a role, it's not the whole story. We, as consumers, play a significant role in this. We gravitate towards forms of media that make us feel good and validate our existing beliefs, which brings us to our next point. Our attraction to certain media types isn't just about the stories they tell, but how they align with what we already believe. This is where confirmation bias comes into play. Confirmation bias is our tendency to seek information that confirms our pre-existing beliefs and ignores or rejects information that contradicts them. This bias can significantly affect how we perceive the economy and other aspects of our world. Here's a simple way to understand confirmation bias. Have you ever read reviews for a product you already bought? Chances are you were looking for positive reviews that confirmed that you made a good purchase. We do the same thing with news and information. If you believe the economy is doing poorly, you're more likely to seek out and remember stories that reinforce this belief. This bias creates an echo chamber effect where we're only exposed to information that aligns with our views, further entrenching our beliefs. It's like having a mental highlighter that only picks out bad news, even if there's plenty of good news out there. Our choice of where we seek news is often self-affirming. Confirmation bias causes our brain to confirm that we already know the truth, and we love the warm, cuddly feeling of being told what we already believe is true. We like being presented data that agrees with it, or if conflicting data is shown by our media source, it's often done in a way that actually tries to reinforce our already held beliefs. We become the inverse Mulder and Scully. The truth isn't out there, it's already in our heads, and we do everything we can to confirm what we already believe. But wait, you say? I know I'm constantly seeing data that agrees. It's everywhere. First, I say, don't interrupt me. Secondly, thanks for the segue to our next bias. Next up is the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon, also known as the frequency illusion. Have you ever bought a new car and then you suddenly notice that same model everywhere? That's Baader-Meinhof at work. Once you become aware of something, like economic struggles, your brain starts noticing it more often, creating the illusion that these issues are more prevalent than they actually are. Imagine you hear a lot of news about inflation. Suddenly, you start noticing prices going up everywhere, at the grocery store, gas station, even in online shopping. This doesn't necessarily mean prices are skyrocketing across the board. It's just that your brain is now tuned to notice these instances more frequently, reinforcing your belief that inflation is rampant. The frequency illusion turns our mind into a mental highlighter again, drawing our attention to instances that we would have completely ignored the day before. This brings us to our personal experience bias, which is how our own experience and that of those close to us shape our perceptions, exposure, and beliefs in trends. This bias can be particularly strong because personal stories and experiences have a more significant emotional impact. This is closely related to the law of small numbers, which is the tendency to draw broad conclusions from small sample sizes. For example, suppose you hear a few stories about people struggling with rising prices. In that case, you might conclude that everyone has experienced significant inflation, even if the data shows a more moderate trend. Not to pick on the media, but news stations love this. It becomes a personal interest story. Rather than present data like a nerd, they talk to someone who's really experiencing something terrible and allow that to play into our negativity bias, combined with the law of small numbers to presume this issue is running rampant. We then let Baader-Meinhof into the party, and now we're noticing all these examples. And guess what? They're all confirming what we already believe. And that's a huge problem. Data be damned. So what can we do to better align our perceptions with reality? Here's some strategies. First, I encourage you to seek out news and perspectives from multiple sources, especially those that offer a different viewpoint. Websites like AllSides can help you see how the same story is reported differently across the political spectrum. Here's an article from the time I was preparing this video on the US economy. You can see different perspectives. So we get a view from the political left, from the Atlantic, next to a lean right perspective from the Washington Examiner. I also like this chart from MediaBiasChart.com. They provide a nice visual representation to understand where your preferred news sources fall on both a political and reliability spectrum. I encourage you to check out where your sources fall. Just like investing, if you say, I'm totally diversified, I own Nvidia, Intel, and AMD, you may not really be achieving your diversification goals. The same goes for saying, oh, I diversify in my news sources. I watch both Rachel Maddow and Chris Hayes, or I love Sean Hannity and Laura Ingraham. You may not be as well-rounded as you think. Next up is critical thinking. Always question the validity and reliability of the information you encounter. Look for evidence and check the sources of claims. This helps you move beyond the gut feeling to a more informed understanding. Consider if there's other motives in presenting the information in a certain way. How close to the source is your information? And how much interpretation are you receiving? Getting someone else's perspective is fine. I just encourage you to not be a sponge and adapt their talking points without thinking for yourself. To counteract our confirmation biases, actively look for information that contradicts your existing beliefs. This can be uncomfortable, but it's crucial for a balanced view. Try to understand and articulate opposing arguments. This takes me back to college with my roommates, one of whom is now a lawyer and absolutely in the correct profession. Often we would start a heated debate over a specific topic, and at some point, it would go all Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck. If you can't pivot and rabbit season your duck season, you may not really understand the issue and risk falling victim to these biases. Be aware of your cognitive biases and take time to reflect on your reaction to information. When you encounter a news story that elicits a strong emotional response, pause and consider why it affected you that way. Reflecting on your emotional triggers can help you develop a more balanced perspective. Emotions are a great flag of our biases or deeply held beliefs. Remember that a lot of advertisers realize this, and your emotional response can and will be used against you. Catching yourself in these states early can help highlight underlying thoughts that you may need to overcome to achieve information balance. Before we wrap up with one more psychological phenomenon, I want to share another piece of advice. As a data guy, one of my rules for critical thinking is beware of numbers in isolation. Unemployment is 3.9%. Inflation is 3.4%. So what? Numbers need context. That's why I've tried to share data with visuals, including changes over time. That provides the context you need. For example, the national average price for a gallon of gas right now is $3.73. So what? People are outraged at the moment. Context matters. So here's a graph of the price of gas in America since the early 90s. And since I know you're going to ask, here's an overlay of the political party in the White House during this time. Nationally, prices are down from over $5 a gallon at the peak of inflation in June 2022, and overall, they're actually a little bit lower than some of the latter portion of the George W. Bush administration. The key message is to be cautious when you see a number by itself. It's dangerous and may be there just to confuse you. I want to share one other bias that I believe is a significant factor across various aspects of American perception at the moment. That's the impact of our brain recalling memories. Nostalgia can be a powerful force. There's a psychological phenomenon known as the fading effect bias, where negative emotions associated with past events fade more quickly than positive ones. This means when we look back, we tend to remember the good times more vividly and forget the bad. For instance, I want you to think about your favorite vacation. When you first recall it, your mind likely floods with positive emotions. Great times with those you love, maybe in a special place together for the first time. However, I want you to dive deeper into that memory and try to remember the exact day. Maybe you went to Disney World. Somebody cut you off on the way there and then stole your parking place. You recall how much lunch was in the park. Maybe you were in a foreign country and had the stress of experiencing a new place and trying to communicate with people who didn't speak the language. Our brains are amazing. Over time, these rough edges get smoothed out, leaving us with a mostly positive recollection. This is why investing in experiences can provide some of the best emotional return on investment. Stuff breaks, but experiences, often like fine wine, improve over time. This selective memory reconstruction can skew our perception, making us believe the past was better than it really was. This bias influences how we view our current situation and contributes to the perception that things are getting worse. As we live our daily lives living in the now, we focus on bills we need to pay, car problems, annoying coworkers, but our mind will take care of that in the long run and give us only the high points of our experiences, just like scrolling on Facebook memories. So what does this mean for our interpretation of the current economic situation? It means that our nostalgia for the past combined with our daily stressors can make today's challenges seem worse than they are. This is where critical thinking and contextual understanding come into play. For example, we may feel that inflation is out of control, and the reality is it's significantly lower than it was in its peak in 2022. Recognizing this helps to put today's experience into perspective and mitigates the impact of our biased memories. So let's summarize what we've discussed today. There's a significant gap between public sentiment and actual data regarding the economy. Factors like confirmation bias, the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon, experience bias, media sensationalism, and nostalgia all contribute to this discrepancy. To counteract these biases, we need to diversify our information sources, practice critical thinking, seek disconfirming evidence, and be mindful of our cognitive biases. By doing so, we can gain a more accurate and positive perspective of our current situation and be more informed by facts than relying on our gut's truthiness. As always, thank you so much for watching. Remember to keep thinking critically and question information you come across. While challenges do exist, most aspects of our lives as humans continue to improve. Being informed and critically evaluating the data we consume, we can gain a clearer and more positive perspective on the world. What are your thoughts? Did anything surprise you about this discussion? What steps will you take to be better informed and appropriately challenge your personal truthiness? If you found this useful, I'd really appreciate you clicking like and consider subscribing to my channel for more insights in the future. For another perspective on how we view our past and its impact on our future, check out my video on the end of history illusion here. Thanks so much for watching, keep thinking, and we'll talk again soon.